Hello, welcome to Mexico Now Festival, which has opened this panel about a really interesting conversation, which will arrive, that is racism, continuing the conversation. I would like to introduce you to Eduardo Porter and Federico Navarrete Linares, and I am Tatiana García. Eduardo Porter was born in Phoenix and grew up in the United States, Mexico, and Belgium. He's an economist reporter for the New York Times and has been a correspondent in Tokyo and London. He's the author of The Price of Everything in 2011, which is an exploration of the cost-benefit analysis that underpin human behavior and institution, and also American Poison, which was published in 2020, which aims to show the race is the root of U.S. problems. Also, Federico Navarrete Linares is a Mexican historian, anthropologist, and a researcher who specializes in the history of Mesoamerica, as well as the colonization of racism in Mexico. In 2019, he published the platform Noticonquista, a project that narrates and analyzes the conquest of Mexico through Twitter. Navarrete published work on racism, also includes Alfabeto del Racismo Mexicano, the Alphabet of Mexican Racism in 2017, and México Racista, una denuncia, which is Racist Mexico, a denunciation in 2016. I am Tatiana García. I am a film and media producer and also the radio host of the podcast Negritud in Convoy Network. So I welcome you, Eduardo and Federico. I will really briefly would like to ask you, each one of you, what have driven you to speak about racism and what is so important about it. So let's start with Eduardo, please.
Thank you, Tatiana. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. So listen, I have like kind of two thoughts about this question that you just posed, and one is kind of like there's the immediate contemporary shocking answer is when I started writing about my current book, American Poison, which is about how racial hostility really undermined the social contract in the United States. Well, I started writing that. I started thinking about that book, writing the proposal for that book in the spring of 2015. And the spring of 2015 was, or a little bit thereafter, was the moment where actually Donald Trump entered the presidential race as Republican candidate. And suddenly racism or racial hostility was all over the political discourse in this country. And so I remember my thought was, gosh, only a few years ago in 2012, I remember when Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney in the previous presidential election, the thought of the Republican Party issued this mea culpa and had this kind of like moment of introspection in where it thought, gosh, guys, we've got to reach out to the America of color, because in the words of Senator Lindsey Graham, there aren't enough old white guys to keep us in power for very long. So we have to kind of like broaden the net of what we are. And suddenly I'm thinking, looking at 2015 and then into 2016, the presidential candidate is really deploying racist rhetoric as a tool to get into the White House. Now, I thought that was insane. I didn't really never expected in the 21st century United States we would have such overtly racist thoughts on such a high political stage, and that would ultimately be so successful in delivering the presidency to Donald Trump. But I also have kind of like I also have a little bit of an older answer, and the older answer doesn't start with thinking about racism, but it starts with thinking about things like America's dead babies, its maternal mortality, its really short life expectancy, and so I didn't grow up here mostly, though I was born here. I grew up mostly outside of the United States, and I returned about 20 years ago to work in Los Angeles, writing for the Wall Street Journal. And I remember that at the time, one of the things that just kept bugging me was this thought that I was living in the richest country in the history of the world, and that there was so many really crummy social and economic outcomes out there. I mean, again, you looked at it in the health stats. I kid you not, infant mortality in the United States is on a par with Croatia's, like in something like 50th place worldwide. Our maternal mortality rate exceeds anything of advanced countries. Our life expectancy is amongst the shortest. And you can go on and on. Our incarceration rate is amongst the highest. The number of babies born to single parents is enormously high. Child poverty is off the charts. And so I remember back then starting to think, well, why? How can these two things, how can this wealth and this poverty coexist, right? Because of course the immediate cause for so many of these outcomes is poverty. So the question becomes, why does the United States allow this poverty, this deprivation to persist? And, you know, and as I was like digging into this kind of question, I kept bumping into an answer that led me to this book, which is it's all about racial hostility. I mean, the nutshell response was racial hostility prevented the United States from building the public goods, from building a social contract that incorporated everybody. And so it's essentially like, you know, there were barriers of race that prevented a sense of common good that would work across all Americans. So that underpins a lot of our hostility towards taxes, our hostility towards public spending. It underpins like movements like the Tea Party, which basically came into being in opposition to the first expansion of the social safety net since Lyndon Johnson. And that has basically impoverished our country and allowed it to become, in my opinion, quite dysfunctional. And so when I came to this conclusion, well, basically racism, and one can use different terms, racial hostility, contempt, fear, tribalism, all these, you know, kind of like concepts work together. It impeded the creation of a society that could see it itself as a whole and contribute to its well-being as a whole. And so that's sort of like, that's what's motivated my current thinking about race and my current writing about race.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eduardo. Federico.
Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you to Eduardo. And well, actually, my reply coming from Mexico will be in many ways quite the opposite from Eduardo's, because in Mexico, racism is not a public issue, or at least it's not an issue that finds its way into public discourse. There are no overtly racist political parties. There are no overtly racist politicians. So racism in Mexico is in a way more hidden than in the US, which doesn't mean at all that it's less destructive or that its impacts are not comparable to those of the US, but we need to approach it in a different way. And precisely my reasons for dealing with racism reflect this difference from the US. For starters, my first impression of racism in Mexico came from family experiences. And this is a common feature. Racism in Mexico is very much a private phenomenon that has to do with ideas, representations of beauty, who's beautiful, which is usually people who are whiter, supposedly, and who is socially desirable, who is usually people who are whiter, also supposedly. And so these values, which are fairly widespread in society and which no one really acknowledges as true racism, but just as that's the way things are. Or also there's a lot of racism in Mexican humor. We always mock each other because of the color of our skin, our physical appearances, whether we look like indigenous people or we look like blacks. And that's supposed to be the matter for humor and derision and all that. So my first experiences of racism were these kind of personal and family experiences. My mother particularly had been the victim of quite brutal racist actions from members of her family, which is a fairly common occurrence in Mexico when young women, for instance, don't have the desired racial attributes. Sometimes there's a way of whitening them. In the case of my mother, she had her hair shaven 2 times to improve the shape of her hair, which is a very racially charged subject in all Latin America. Curly hair is supposed to be bad because it denotes an African American origin, and straight hair is supposed to be better because it's supposed to be, or to appear more European. So she was forced to shave her hair 2 times when she was a little girl by a relative, and that was a a deeply wounding experience for her. So my first awareness of racism was within this private family framework. And it was also within my school. I went to private school in Mexico City, and all of my fellow students were very progressive and children of highly educated families, and they were terribly racist all the time. And they were always laughing at me and other people because we were browner than the average. And so there was this, for me, it was an everyday experience of racism in Mexico. And I was aware of it because of my mother's story, mostly. And when I tried to talk with my friends or with other people about racism in Mexico 15 or 20 years back, the most common answer was that racism doesn't really exist in Mexico. Look at the US, that's where they have racism. I mean, we don't have a Ku Klux Klan here. There's no racist laws. There's no Jim Crow in Mexico. So Mexico is not really racist. And all that you're complaining about, well, those are family matters. I mean, look them up with your psychoanalyst or get over it. That's the sort of thing that was heard then. But also, and that would be my personal answer, but unfortunately, in the past 15 years, things have changed a lot in Mexico, particularly the rise of the indigenous movement, the increasing visibility of indigenous intellectuals and indigenous politicians has also, they have complained and talked about the racism they are subjected to in everyday life and in social life. And so racism has become more of a political issue in Mexico. And of course, like everything else in Mexico, it has become linked with the atrocious violence we have been living during the past 20 years. The so-called war against drugs, which is actually a generalized state of civil warfare in Mexican society, has followed these racist fault lines of Mexican society. So in a way, the reflection about violence is also a reflection about race and vice versa. So that race has become a much more urgent issue in Mexico. And that's what motivated me to write the books you mentioned earlier. Alfabeto del Racismo Mexicano and México Racista were, in a way, my responses to this new reality of Mexican violence, of racialized violence in Mexico. So that violence in Mexico is no longer this family affair that it used to be, but has become a much more public and widespread phenomenon, which is the subject of political discussion and contention. That's why I thought to write these books to contribute to this debate.
Thank you so much, Federico and Eduardo. Very interesting to know about this. My perspective, which I have been a citizen of both countries and an Afro-Latina, it means a lot to have these conversations. In a more broad question for both of you, is like, what you think are the social, economical, tangible consequences of living in societies that are racist? So let me start with Eduardo.
Well, I mean, if you've been looking out the window, paying attention over the past couple of months in the United States, yes, one can detect an immediate impact of the racial animus in the, the deaths of African-American men, extrajudicial killings of African-American men at the hands of the police that seem to happen with frightening, depressing regularity. But that is only one cause. I mean, the next step is looking at how criminal justice is imparted in the United States and how it is immensely racialized, how the share of African-American men that have been imprisoned in a war on crime that has gone on for half a century now is amazing, depriving African-American children of their fathers and contributing to a pattern of marginalization of African-American communities. But I would, and by the way, one can go, it's easy to go on. So segregation, educational segregation that has shunted the children of African-American families and other families of color to less well-funded schools, residential segregation, which stopped and mostly African-American families from moving into suburban settings and kind of like confined them to what became known as urban ghettos, segregation at work, discrimination at work. I mean, so there is a clear pattern of discrimination and segregation that affects communities of color in where they can live, where they can go to school. whether their vote is going to count, how easy it will be for them to vote, what kind of jobs they can hold, whether they end up in prison or not. But one of the propositions, and that is all enormously costly. There is I write about economics, so you will please excuse my biases, but there is a recent paper by Eric Hurst at the University of Chicago and a couple of other economists that tried to measure the cost of discrimination, of keeping out of the labor force women and African-American men in order to keep the jobs for white men, right? So that discrimination designed to keep out Blacks and women had an enormous economic cost because there were actually excellent African-American workers and women workers that were kept from actually contributing to the economy of this country by discrimination. So there is a clear economic, a direct economic cost. But the way that I see it, and again, that was kind of like a motivating force for me, was not necessarily looking at the country's economic output, but looking at, again, this thought of what I was mentioning before, the dead babies and the dead mothers and the short lifespans and the off the charts poverty rates and premature death rates. All of these things belie this notion that this is a rich country. And they do affect predominantly communities of color. So a lot of the dead babies are born to mothers of color, to poor mothers of color. But it does not exclusively damage communities of color. It really hurts all vulnerable populations in the United States. So, those white communities that are now, addled by opioids, where the men have lost their jobs or are stuck in really low wage jobs, those people too are suffering from a lack of access to a social safety net, like to universal health care and other, to childcare programs, to unemployment programs, to programs that would help hold up the line for the most vulnerable elements of society. And so you see the cost. The cost is not confined to communities of color. The cost is really to the nation as a whole. And just to not to alarm everybody, but my final, again, thought of the moment is we cannot lose sight of this moment, because racial hostility is right now the prime force shaping American politics. So if you're thinking, well, what's the cost? What is it doing? Well, right now, American politics are really shaped by the sense of conflict of a aging white population who is seeing its power erode by demography, essentially. And so this white population, which has controlled power since the birth of the nation, is trying to do whatever it can to prevent that from happening. Like the erosion of the Voting Rights Act, the gerrymandering, all these techniques to limit and suppress the vote in communities with lots of minority voters. All of these things are manifestation of this one kind of attempt by a minoritarian group of power, which has selected itself into the Republican Party, to stop the new America from coming into power. And so I think that if you've been reading the papers or looking out the window, this has led to some pretty scary moment in our politics. And you all are going to go out to vote tomorrow, I hope, if you haven't done it yet. But I am actually quite scared about what this polarization, which I think is racial in origin, is bringing us to.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Federico.
Well, I think that most of the consequences of racism already mentioned by Eduardo also exist in Mexico. There is recent sociological studies in Mexico for the past 15 years, and there's been plenty of them, have shown that there is a very strong correlation between the color of your skin and your social position in Mexico. So that whiter people are usually richer, have better education, have more access to health and all kinds of social services than browner people. And this inequality has been going on in Mexico for centuries, actually. It originated in the colonial period when there was a radical distinction between the fates of Spaniards, or people of Spanish origin who had all the privileges, and the fates of people of African origin who were enslaved, and the fate of the indigenous people who were forced to work and pay tribute to the Spaniards. So this is deeply rooted in Mexican history, but this inequality, this racial inequality, has been maintained and even deepened throughout modernization in Mexico. So it's in a way a very old phenomenon from 5 centuries back, but it's also a very new phenomenon from neoliberalism and the reforms of the 80s and 90s. And I think that one of the main consequences of racism in Mexico, first of all, is that we should take into account that the proportions of the populations involved are radically different in Mexico and the US. In the US, until recently, and that's what Eduardo was talking about, there was supposedly a white majority that excluded different minorities of the population, be they Black, be they indigenous, be they Mexican, or whatever. In Mexico, for the contrary, the white population or the privileged group has always been a very tiny majority, no more than 20% of the population, and the groups that have been excluded have been the greatest majorities of the population. For instance, in the early 19th century, in Mexico, there were perhaps more people of African origin than people of white origin, of European origin in Mexico. But actually, Black Mexicans were erased from the social consciousness. They were not recognized as a legal group. They were given no rights. And so most of them sort of blended in or disappeared. Of course, there are identifiably African-American people in Mexico, but they have been subject to 200 years of invisibilization. So that many Mexicans are actually quite surprised when they find a Mexican who is Black, because we tend to assume that there are no Black people in Mexico. That's an example of a consequence of racism, but also in the relation with brown people, with people of indigenous origins or mixed blood people, mestizos as we call them in Mexico. I think that racism has had a huge historical consequence. And this can be summarized in two points. Mexico is the country that has expelled or forced to migrate the highest proportion of its population in the whole world. So to this day, today, Mexico is the country that has more Mexicans living abroad, or people of Mexican origin living abroad, nationals of their own origin living abroad, than any other country of the world. And most of them, as you know, live in the US, have migrated to the US. I think that this mass migration of Mexicans, which has been going on since the late 19th century in several waves, all through the 20th century, and had this huge wave in the 1990s and early 2000s, because of the NAFTA and all the neoliberal reforms in Mexico, this huge wave of migration is a consequence of Mexican racism. These people were forced to leave their homeland, were forced to emigrate because they didn't have any opportunities in Mexico. And that was in many ways because of the racism that prevented them from climbing in the social ladder in Mexico. So they had to go to the US. And one of the saddest paradoxes is that now in the US, they have become the victims of the most violent racism from the president himself. So this Mexican population of migrants were in a way refugees from Mexican racism that have come to the US to be victims of American racism. I think that's, it's hard to find a sadder picture for a population that being run out of your own country and then being subjected to persecution in the country that gives you harbor or that you are forced to migrate into. And I think that would be an example. We could have many others, but maybe one of the worst consequences of racism in Mexico is that it has naturalized inequality. Because most of the poor people in Mexico have one color of skin, they tend to be darker, then it's easier to assume that they are poor because they are different, that they are poor because they are ignorant, that they are poor because they are lazy, that they are poor for many other reasons. And this racialized difference between the elites who are whiter and the great majority of the population who's not white sort of makes it natural that the great majority of the population is deprived of elementary rights, even recently of the right to live because of the violence. So I think those might be two of the worst consequences of Mexican racism in the past 200 years. the one that
Big consequences. um, in your own perspective, and of course because of your multiculturality, I would like to ask you, like, after the event of George Floyd in the United States, which has impacted the world, this is something that has strong analysis in Mexico, even towards its own racism. But I also want to ask Eduardo at the same time is why this event of George Floyd, even though we know Black Lives Matter movement become earlier, but now is a crucial moment that it awaken up basically the whole world. And what will be your analysis of, like, this is a specific moment that happened in the US, and at the same time to Federico later on to ask him the same question, why you think this event moved Mexico in so many ways. So we'll start with you, Eduardo.
That's a very, very interesting question, Tatiana. I wanted first, if I may, to comment on the point Federico just made.
Sure.
I just wanted to kind of like note that, in fact, this correlation between skin tone and economic opportunity is also extremely prevalent in the United States, right? And also the correlation between death rates from COVID and skin tone is also extremely tight. And the arguments, the rhetoric, the narratives that are used around these things are very similar to what you just mentioned. So if you look at the moment in which the United States sort of turns against the idea of welfare, when, the moment that, there's this 30 years from the New Deal on, in which the state is building this apparatus to, help vulnerable Americans coming out of the Great Depression. And there's a turning point, which happens roughly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the argument becomes, oh, welfare is just a giveaway to lazy people. And the tropes with when we start talking about, we start using the word welfare, and it becomes a pejorative term. And we invent creatures like the welfare queen, which was an invention of President Ronald Reagan, which was ostensibly this Black woman driving a Cadillac, abusing the Social Security system. And so, that moment of transformation of the narrative surrounding government assistance and the safety net and whatnot, well, what is the salient thing that happens? Civil rights. So it's like, FDR goes up and building this big, social safety net, but it was very, very exclusive. It was pretty much, many of the programs were for whites only, including Social Security and the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. As soon as Blacks are kind of invited to join in the benefits of citizenship, the discourse becomes somewhat like what you were talking about. This is for, this is for people who are different, have different morals, different attitudes, are undeserving in some way. And that is, I think, still what dominates the discourse around, the public services today, and the notion of what the commons owes to its citizens. But excuse me, sorry for that little digression there.
No, that's totally fine.
The thing about that, I think that why George Floyd kind of sort of lit the fuse is an interesting and difficult question. I mean, my first order answer is I don't know. I can throw out some ideas because my guess is that perhaps the pandemic played some role. The pandemic pretty much had everybody on edge. Also, public spaces were sort of empty due to social distancing, which gave more opportunity to express, protests on the streets. There wasn't streets full of restaurants and people moving around. So that offered a geographical opportunity. Another thought would be that this administration was kind of exacerbating a lot of these tensions around race that are not new, as you point out. Black Lives Matter is a movement that has a number of years, and in fact, the extrajudicial killing of African-American men by the police has been going on for a very, very, very long time. So it's I wonder whether the fact that we had a president that had brought racism and put it straight on the table, without euphemisms, just, in his first campaign talking about Mexicans, in his current campaign talking about, you know, protecting white suburban women from blacks moving into their neighborhoods. So the fact that racism was very much already front and center of the conversation, perhaps kind of like allowed this the conversation, the discussion over these extrajudicial killings to move quickly into, we have a systemic institutional problem in this country. It's just not a random death. It's how we've designed this country, and that is not acceptable. And I've got to tell you that one of the, I am a pessimist by nature, hence I became a journalist. But one of the few things that makes me feel a little optimistic was looking around on the protests on the streets and seeing that it wasn't just limited to young African Americans protesting against these killings. There were a lot of non-African, there were a lot of white kids, a lot of Asian Americans, a lot of Latinos marching together. So that made me feel, well, maybe we finally, especially in in American cities, amongst young people who are more used to living with each other and seeing each other as humans rather than as representatives of some racial or ethnic class. So maybe we're just ready. But, you know, just to end this in the spirit of pessimism that I carry with me all the time, it remains to be seen how much staying power this is going to have. Okay, this, you know, I remember Occupy Wall Street and the enthusiasm that there was over the movement of the 99%, and it just kind of fizzled away. And as you pointed out, the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for some time, and it hasn't really, or it had not really achieved enormous political traction. So let's see. I mean, it remains to be seen whether this is whether this becomes a real, if this really becomes a game changer.
Thank you so much. Federico.
Well, thank you, Tatiana. I think that the situation in Mexico is more complicated, perhaps, but not, I wouldn't say more complicated, but it's dissimilar from the US in two aspects. First, the discussion about racism hadn't really had so much traction until a few months back, and it was also a consequence of the George Floyd moment in the US and all that, and now it's become much more visible publicly. But also, I think that this sudden visibility is the result not only of American influence, which has been important, but also of two different endogenous factors from Mexican society. The first, and they are actually contradictory between each other, so I think that poses a major problem for the development of an anti-racist politics in Mexico in the coming years. The first factor in this groundswell of preoccupation about racism was, I think, the mobilization and electoral victory of our current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was in a way, he presented himself as the political representative and the leader of these excluded majorities that had been the historical victims of racism in Mexico. He didn't do it explicitly with an anti-racist politics, but many of his words, of his rhetoric, many aspects of his rhetoric had to do with this exclusion. For instance, his insistence in speaking not very correct Spanish. He speaks a local dialect of Spanish from Tabasco, and this is very badly seen by the elites in Mexico City because it's supposed to be an incorrect way of speaking. But in a way, it was a reivindication by him of how the elite Spanish spoken by tiny minorities in Mexico City is not the only way to speak. That there are other ways to speak Spanish in Mexico, and of course there are many other languages in Mexico. There are the indigenous languages, and over 12 million people speak languages that are not Spanish. So in a way, this defense of linguistic plurality was a way to fight the racism that has been associated with the prevalence of some kind of Spanish over other kinds of Spanish. And in many ways, López Obrador presents himself as the representative of the people, which is these groups that have been the victims of discrimination. So I think that this greater awareness of racism in Mexico could be the result of the political mobilization and the electoral success of this coalition of excluded groups. That would be one of the two elements. But sadly, the other element is completely different from this one. And I think it has more traction and has more chance to last, but it's contradictory to the first element. And this has been the increasing mobilization by different groups of victims of violence in Mexico against the generalized violence in our society. For the past 20, as many of you know, in the past 20 years, over 200,000 people have been murdered in Mexico. We have over 100,000 disappeared people, but we never know because the government keeps no track of disappearances. So we don't even have an exact figure of the people who have been disappeared in the past 15 to 20 years. And in the past, of course, this has produced a massive mobilization of victims of this violence. Relatives of the disappeared and the murdered people have been mobilizing for many years. And more recently, and this has been much more visible and has had a greater impact on Mexican society, women have been protesting against femicide and violence against women in general. And these mobilizations have been very strong. They have been very similar to Black Lives Matter. They have been very contentious. Some of them have been riots, actually, and they have vandalized, I don't like the word, but they have intervened on public monuments demanding justice for women. And I think that another element of this current awareness against racism in Mexico is the result of this mobilization by victims of violence. Sadly, this mobilization of victims of violence has not been understood by the government. So that, for instance, López Obrador has had very bad relations with the mobilized women, and he has been absolutely incapable of understanding what they are demanding. And this lack of sensitivity sort of points the contradiction I was telling you about. So for instance, we have a mass movement by excluded majorities, and we have very vocal movements by victims of violence that are demanding more justice. But sadly, the government doesn't see that maybe they could be joined together into a generalized movement for social justice and against violence in Mexico, and sort of thinks that these protests go against the massive mobilization that the government wants to promote. So we're in some sort of conflict that I think shouldn't exist, because I think that basically the people who back López Obrador and the people who protest against violence are both fighting systemic violence, systemic racism, systemic sexism, and class discrimination in Mexico, and they should be together. But sadly, the leaders of the mass movement, López Obrador and his allies, don't see it that way. So I think that in the coming months, there's going to be a confrontation between these two different movements, which actually shouldn't be confronted, because I think that they are fighting for the same things, but the political leaders don't recognize that. So that's one of the risks we face, that maybe this confrontation will stop the mobilization against racism and against violence. And on the other hand, the government has proven over and over that they don't have any clues of how to stop the violence. So we are in a very difficult situation where the people who are mobilizing against the violence may be repressed by the government, who's also not doing anything effective to end the violence. So I'm afraid I will be a pessimist like Eduardo too, even though I'm not a journalist, and say that I'm not very optimistic of what these two movements could bring together a radical transformation of Mexican society.
Thank you so much for so complicated, but I'm very interested about everything that you're saying. I wanted to ask our audience that if they would like to send some questions for Eduardo and Federico, that please do it at the Q&A. There's a little box there where you can share your questions, and later on I will express them I will ask them to please answer. I would like to ask you another question, which is, in this dynamic of Mexico and the US, and there is a correlation, sadly, about racism that is generated in many, many aspects, like education, sociology, and also media. What will be your perspectives of how equally influenced even the United States to Mexico and Mexico to United States? I think you spoke a little bit about it, Federico, early on, about immigration, but I will also like to go a little bit more in depth on that. So if you would like to start, Eduardo.
I'm not sure I captured, I got the question though. Are you interested in understanding kind of like differences between how racism is expressed in Mexico?
No, in the United States towards Mexico.
Oh,
And
I see. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. So for sure, I mean, it's not new, and yet to me it was amazingly surprising how hostility towards Mexican immigrants had such political power just a few years ago. I remember looking at polls about, you know, people's belief about immigration, and it didn't really rank as a very high priority. If you know, Pew asked people out there, what do you think? Is it good or bad for the country? About 2/3 said it was, or maybe even 3/4 said it was a net good thing. The share of people who thought we should have fewer immigrants in the United States was actually trending kind of down. And then, but all you needed was a guy to sit on a soapbox and say, I'm going to protect you from these rapists coming over from south of the border. And this became the most salient kind of proposition of an entire presidential campaign. To me, that was kind of like breathtaking. And, and the point is, I was, in a way, I was surprised. I feel like I was surprised that even today that this had this kind of salience, and it kind of made me reconsider my understanding of sort of like the American social compact, the sense of the story that we tell ourselves about who we are as a nation. I mean, for once and for all, if I had any the naivete to believe that there was any truth into this idea of the melting pot, 2016 and 2015 totally, you know, destroyed any such trust. But yes, I mean, Mexicans were lynched, Mexicans have been expelled, hurt, killed because of the color of their skin, because they come from a different culture, because they come from across the border, for, you know, over 100 years now. So this is certainly not a new fact. And one of the little nuggets of information that I love to share with my liberal friends is that, you know, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into power in the depths of the Great Depression, he did not end Hoover's program of deporting everybody that even looked sort of Mexican, you know, or had a Mexican name. FDR continued this policy of deportation, you know, the idea of getting rid of these, you know, of this excess labor force that kind of like looked different from us. So this is, it's a constant. So I would say, I would caveat that, yes, this is not like the deep wound that slavery kind of like imposed on the African American community. That is, I think, the main driver of racial animus still today, but it has been prevalent forever. I mean, in the 1924 Immigration Act, which was designed to keep out of the United States Central Europeans, Southern Europeans, and very clearly Latin Americans and Mexicans, most prominently among them, that, you know, and that immigration law remained in force from 1924 through 1965. And today, even though if you look at President Trump, again, he has pivoted from rapist Mexicans and the wall to poor blacks in the suburbs, it's essentially the same pot of difference that he is. So he is proposing a world of white Americans that is arrayed defensively, crouched against non-white Americans that are coming to take, you know, their economic prerogatives, their political power, their social spaces, and Mexicans are very, very clearly part of that, and they have always been clearly part of that. Thinking into the future, I mean, I do think that it's an open question how the Latino community, and more narrowly the Mexican American community, is going to fit within the American kind of like mix. You know, is our future going to be, is the dividing line, the dividing racial line in the future of the United States going to be white versus non-white? Is there going to be like a coalition of color, the coalition of the oppressed today, you know, that will become a powerful voting bloc with shared fears and shared goals and objectives, or instead will we see, you know, a balkanization of groups according to kind of like differential tribal identities? Or, as I've read some sociologists produce, well, maybe what we end up is with a world where you have the dividing line is black versus non-black, and you have an integration of like Latino Americans into kind of like the white mainstream, much like what happened with Italians and Portuguese and Southern Europeans in the, you know, in the Northeast in the first half of the 20th century, when the great migration of African Americans from the South into the Northeast and the Midwest kind of like convinced all the German and Anglo whites to invite the Italians into their whiteness, because there was something that was kind of like even more alien coming to share their cities. So I don't know, I find that's, maybe that kind of like goes beyond the scope of your question, but I think I find that an interesting question. How is this, how are racial politics that are so powerful here, how are they eventually going to evolve as the nation's demography changes?
Thank you so much. And in that note, Federico, it's just like my question goes also in respect of what just Eduardo explained really clearly. Do you think this model has its repercussions into Mexico's story in how we see racism and how it has worked politically in Mexico?
Of course, when you have about 20% or 25% of Mexican population living in the US, and you have basically that almost all families in Mexico have relatives or friends or close acquaintances who have migrated to the US, who go back and forth, of course, there's very strong influence. Actually, some of my fellow activists in the struggle against racism share, and it's a fairly common story, share this story. They grew up in Mexico and were always the object of some sort of jokes, and they were segregated and discriminated upon in ways they could not sort of understand why. And when they migrated into the US and saw how racism worked in the US, they had like this eureka moment, and they realized, oh, well, what I had been experiencing in Mexico was actually what in the US is called racism and is overtly and publicly recognized as racism. But in Mexico, of course, it's not supposed to happen because it only happens in the US. So this kind of recognition of a commonality of the experience of being discriminated against and being the victim of this kind of the butt of jokes and all that, all this, the way Mexican racism works was an enlightenment for them. It gave them also a vocabulary to talk about this, to talk about race. In Mexico, actually, the talk about race is very difficult because we as Mexicans, we are defined officially all as mixed blood. We are all supposed to be mestizos. So supposedly there's no racial difference. So the first thing you have to do to acknowledge that there's racism in Mexico is to first to acknowledge that there are racial differences or differences in color and culture and all that. And that's been made easier in Mexico because of the visibility of racial differences in the US. So I think that in many ways, for instance, the Chicano movement has had influence in Mexican popular culture. The African American movement in the US has been very influential amongst Afro-Mexicans. There have been many activists who have come to the US from the US into Mexico to work with Afro-Mexicans, and they have sort of struggled together, and they have helped to the growth of Afro-Mexican consciousness in Mexico, which is fairly recent. It's from the past 30 or 40 years. So I think that's been very positive. But I also think that this visibility of racism in the US also can be misleading in Mexico because things actually work differently in Mexico. For instance, in Mexico, people are supposed to change race, which is something that is completely taboo in the US. I mean, when you are an indigenous person in Mexico and you want to rise socially, you want to improve your education, you want to get a better job, the way to do it is to become white in a way. You stop speaking your indigenous language and you start speaking Spanish. You stop dressing in the traditional manner and you start dressing in the modern way. And in many cases, many families in Mexico they look for whiter partners, so their children will have lighter skins as them. in Mexico, there's this, in the whole of Latin America, there's this horrendous expression called improving the race, mejorar la raza. And it's been the strategy for social advancement in Mexico and in Latin America for many years. If you want to rise up socially, you have to become whiter or to appear whiter. So white passing is basically that's the name of the game in Mexican society in many ways. All Mexicans try to pass as white. And that includes, of course, elite Mexicans who go to the US to study in the universities in the US and come back to Mexico to rule Mexico. They are the ultimate white passers. So I think that it's a completely different social phenomenon in many ways from the US. And what I'm afraid is that this racial flexibility in Mexico does not preclude the existence of racism, but it does have certain advantages against the more radical forms of segregation that are sometimes current in the US. And also it has some disadvantages. The point here is that it's not the same. And sometimes importing ideas about race from the US doesn't really help us understand how racism actually works in Mexico and in other Latin America. So I think that we need to have a frequent dialogue with racism in the US, but we also need to understand the particular dynamics of racism in Mexican society and in other Latin American societies.
Federico, yeah, that's super interesting. I wanted to ask you, if I may just jump in here, sorry.
Yeah, please.
Tatiana, I apologize. But, you know, I wonder if the development of this kind of more fluid notion of race that you're talking about in Mexico, how that is kind of like part of a nation building strategy on the part of the Mexican post-colonial state. And because that's one thought that I've had is that this was a tool essentially used to create a Mexico that kind of also would quash a lot of indigenous identity. You know, it's sort of like, you know, this is a way to impose, no, we're all mestizos, you know, cosmic race and all that stuff. And that allows us to basically ignore that, you know, there's tzotziles and tzetzales and, you know, there's all these nations inside us. And we can therefore ignore their rights, ignore their, you know, their need for resources, and basically, you know, essentially build power around this definition. It's extremely different from what happened in the United States, because in the United States, you know, racism is used to clearly just to exclude a class, you know, rather than to build a new power structure, it seems.
Yeah, you're totally right. And I think that the simplest explanation for this is once again demographics. In the white elites in 19th century Mexico could not possibly exclude 90% of the population from the nation, because they would have no nation to build. So they had to find a way to integrate them. And the buzzword in Mexico for the past 200 years has been precisely integration, which basically means they should stop being Black, they should stop being Indians, and they should become white. But also at the same time, these elites don't want the whole population to be like them, because they wouldn't be elites anymore. So what racism in Mexico is more like a gradation of who can pretend to be whiter and therefore discriminate those who cannot be as white as they are. So the logic is not so much segregation, but imposing a model and building elitism around that model and making white, everybody has to be white, but of course there's whiter than white. And so there's all these subtle differences that make up Mexican racism.
Thank you so much. I would like to read some questions, like time goes flying. And I would like to go on and on. But there are people in our audience that are sending us some questions. So I would like to ask you this. There's a question that says, here's, hi, thanks for this panel. I would love some advice on how can an individual do to help dismantle racism in their country.
You go first, Federico.
Well, I think that, of course, racism is both an individual and a behavioral problem. Racism is things that people do, like calling names to each other, being rude or violent against people because they have a different skin color or because they speak a different language. And these sort of individual attitudes, of course, can be modified. And I think that, I mean, a modern citizen in a democratic state should strive to be rid of racism and to not be overtly racist in social in his social interactions with other people. No? That's an individual thing, and it's an ethical problem, I think. But of course, also racism is systemic. Even if we all change their attitudes, there would still be huge difference of wealth between blacks and whites in the US, between whites and indigenous people in Mexico. There would still be historical inequalities that have seriously affected racialized populations. I mean, for instance, the statistics of health among black population in the US indicate are the consequences of centuries of discrimination and deprivation. And that's not going away because we're suddenly all nice to them and we respect them. Of course, we also need structural transformations. And in the case of Mexico, I think that the greatest problem of Mexico, which is economic inequality, won't be solved if we don't fight against racial discrimination, and vice versa. Racial discrimination won't ever be eliminated as long as there is such a great economic inequality in Mexico. So I think that the basic fight against racism in Mexico, and maybe in the US too, is a fight against economic inequality.
Okay, I will ask another question. How did you think we can break the cycle of racism among Latinos and among Blacks?
Well, I mean, yes. So here, my thought, which kind of also falls from what Federico just said, but applies to this is, I mean, I think that ultimately the response is, the goal is fairly simple. If we can live in a society where we see each other as individual human beings rather than as representatives of a racial ethnic box, from which to define ourselves as different, from which to protect our privileges, that is, I think, the fundamental, the absolutely necessary condition to start creating the policies that would build a more inclusive state. Again, like Federico, I think that ultimately the problem is institutional, and what we have to do is to build the institutions to that make this a more inclusive state. But now, specifically about relations within the Latino community and between Latinos and African American communities, well, they have had the same kind of encounters that every kind of community has when they're competing over political power and over resources. And so one observation to say there is that, you know, racism is not just the purview of white Americans. Racism is ubiquitous, it's as old as the hill, and it has been used by groups to maintain their power versus other groups and to maintain their control over resources versus other groups. And so I think that what's the project to, say, reduce tensions between Latinos and African Americans and within the Latino community, I would say it's the same project as to create an inclusive sense of the United States. It's a project that has to bring, it's not about a project to create a coalition of color to face against white America. It's about building a coalition of Americans, because I don't really think, say, if the outcome is, yes, we have this powerful group of color that is now going to, you know, rule the roost and exercise the same sort of oppressive policies that used to be exercised against them. I don't really see that as a solution for the society. And so ultimately it has to be to build kind of like the idea of inclusive across the board policies. How do you do that? Well, I think that it starts with living together, going to school together. It starts by dismantling segregation. And again, these are things that happen in the these require political will. Things like, you know, I'm thinking now of tomorrow and what's going to happen to the American government, but things like a universal child benefit would probably help kind of like create these, the conditions in which our communities can live more easily together. But again, I am super pessimistic. And in the end, what I see, the first thing that I see is a politics that is going to be determined over the next quarter century by one group trying to stop its erosion in power as other groups grow in relative power. And so I see really, really horrible politics over the next quarter century. And so it's hard for me within that kind of like general framework to think, okay, here's what we should do. But again, you know, it's just my lack of imagination.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's been a pleasure. I'm so sorry that, you know, time runs so fast and we can go so long with this conversation, but I thank you so much. I thank Claudia Norman and the Celebrate Mexico Now Festival for opening this conversation. If you would like to, each of you, wrap up with a thought, please do.
Well, if I may, thanks. Well, I would just say that in the struggle in Mexico is similar to the US, as we have seen, but I think that in a way it's even more dramatic because of the violence we are living in Mexico. The struggle now in Mexico is for life, is for survival against a murderous regime, which is not the government precisely, but it's a complex coalition of organized crime, corrupt officials, corrupt security forces that are literally massacring the population and that are affecting particularly the groups that have been traditionally affected by discrimination: women, indigenous people, poor people. And I think that the fight in Mexico is for the life of those people, that they not be killed anymore, that we don't have as many dead as we have had in the past 20 years. So I think it's even more dramatic, perhaps, or as dramatic as the picture that Eduardo was painting.
Thank you.
So to end in a slightly different way, I will throw a little optimism on the table, and which is that as we were talking earlier about the reaction to the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's going to, one good thing that has come of this moment, I think, is that it's going to become very, very difficult to ignore the racial origins to so many of our inequalities and to so many of the barriers that we put to the vulnerable in our society. Because we've been trying to ignore this forever. If you go and you poll the average American is likely to tell you, and I'm not making this up, that the issue, racism, segregation, discrimination are problems that have been by and large solved. And if you ask them if they feel themselves victims of discrimination, segregation, white American will tell you that yes, that they are now victims because of affirmative action policies that are putting them down, that are choosing the person of color to get into the university rather than your white kid. And so I think that there's a really great study out of Northwestern University which asked people, how much wealth do you think an African-American family has relative to a white family? And the answer, the average answer that they asked them about in the 1960s and in the present, in the 1960s, they said it was about 30%. And today they said, it's about 70%. Well, the real numbers are in the 1960s, it was 5%, and now it's 10%. Now, after half a century of civil rights and, presumably all these progress that we've made, so we've really not made any progress. And so but we really try not to talk about it. So the fact that we're talking about this now, I think is a huge gain over the status quo ante.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, Eduardo, Federico, muchas gracias. Thank you so, so much. And I thank everybody that has been involved, and I thank everybody in the audience. Thank you for being with us this short hour. And I hope there's more spaces for us to have a conversation about identity and racism. So until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Federico,
Thank you.
Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Gracias.